Hello, my name is David Taylor, and this is a video essay about realism in video game design and how we can possibly reimagine the way we think and talk about video games in this particular style. As we all know, video games are still quite a young medium, and so it hasn't quite built the grammar and vocabulary of, say, film or poetry or paintings. Those art forms have had centuries of development and inspiration to help build the way that artists discuss their form and hopefully evolve it. Now, video games are doing this too, actively. Every day on the internet, we discuss and delve deep into the DNA of video game theory. One area I think is not only incredibly important in this time of photorealistic next-gen games and consoles, which we're seeing right now, is to look at realism in the games themselves, not only from a theoretical and artistic point of view, but from a design standpoint also. So over the next 15 or 20 minutes, we're going to look at realism in games, what this means for the art, and in particular, we're going to be looking at two case studies, the French paintings after the French Revolution in the 1850s and Italian neorealist films of the 1940s. We can do this to help us better understand our own art and get some new ideas because we're looking at the way in which those art forms evolved, the way that they began and the way that they're discussed and the way that the vocabulary was built. Let's start by looking at contemporary games that are typically called realistic and see what we consider to be a realistic video game. Now, before we get into this, I have to point out the difference between simulation and realism. When we talk about simulation, usually we're referencing something that is hyper-realistic, something that is exactly the way that it is in real life and it is rendered in the video game. What we actually usually mean by the word simulation is physically realistic. The word simulation is a verb, not a noun, and so if an object, real or virtual, simulates something, it is a simulation. Therefore, in that regard, almost all games are simulations. To state that Farm Simulator 2013 is any more or less of a simulation than Masquerade or The Elder Scrolls is simply stating that Farm Simulator is a simulation of our reality and those other games to their own universes and their own logic. What we're talking about is realism, games that are bound by accuracy and authenticity and truth in regards to the world we live in. This can encompass photorealistic games like Heavy Rain and LA Noire, sport games like Madden and FIFA, but it can also encompass more abstract games like the grandiose Unreal SSX series, the often bizarre Metal Gear Solid series, and even games that you might never consider to be realistic like Pokemon Snap, although that's a little more complex and we'll get into that later. What you'll find is that by simply being bound to certain truths about our world, physically, socio-politically, or even psychologically, we can expand what we think to be realistic portrayals of humanity and Earth. However, that's quite bizarre and vague, so what we need to do is have a framework to help us break apart and categorize these games and their techniques for capturing some form of truth, to help us discuss simulations and realism and authenticity, and we don't quite have these in our common vocabulary as a culture yet. The creative director from People Can Fly says that old game metaphors are dying and we're in a desperate need of a new dictionary. So what we can do is look at other art forms and look at how they evolved such styles. Realism as an art form is a complex and multifaceted world that we can take a lot from. From the naturalist and illusionist styles that simply dictate a need to accurately render the visual world, as seen in paintings like Elif Peterson's The Salmon Fisher, to the more expressive neorealist styles that allow certain artistic licenses to recreate the truth authentically, as seen in films like Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves. In their most basic form, however, all realist styles utilize a simple need to capture truth in some form. In painting, this typically extends to avoiding stylization, and in film and photography, certain techniques can be used to better create the sense of truth with subtext. Precisely and accurately rendering something will capture truth by association with the source material, which one can find in the immaculate Los Angeles and Team Bondi's LA Noire. In fact, one writer for Eurogamer took his grandfather, who lived and worked as a beat cop in LA in the 1940s, on a virtual trip through the game, resulting in some fantastic stories and moments, but the recreation of an entire city cannot be understated. This man actually noted that the accuracy with which the city structures and roadways are recreated is really astounding, and the details were almost perfect. Minor faults would not be evident to those who did not live in the city at that time. For sure, this was a real as well as a virtual return for me to that complex and dark city at that time. Now, to put this all into context, the main two variables of two different movements in realism are their use of abstraction. The supposed purity of photorealism cannot be overlooked, for surely there is no better way to capture truth than to recreate it. Or does simply rendering a moment not make it obsolete for a painting or a film, or not, strictly speaking, reality themselves? Perhaps there must be techniques and abstractions and some level of knowing artifice involved. How does this affect games, their interactivity, their believability, and their design? Well, to better analyze these questions, we'll look at two movements in realism and apply their philosophies to games. So we'll look at French realism and Italian neorealism, and then we'll think about it in the unique form of video games. First, the French realism of the 1850s. After the 1848 French Revolution, French painters and writers began to reject romanticisms which had dominated literature and art for many years prior. They instead opted for painting and writing about very real subject matters of the time in an unflinching and uncompromising manner, depicting harsh and unpleasant aspects of life at the time. It was a revolt against the epic, the dramatic, and the romantic. In doing so, paintings like Jean-François Millet's The Gleaners used photorealism to make social statements by simply showing the truth to growing audiences of realist art. It was an incredibly important movement that spawned further evolutions in Europe and around the world. But in this particular movement, we can see the use of photorealism as a form of realist protest. In video games, we can see some examples of this beginning to take form. Warco, the news game, is an example of this. While it is somewhat low budget, the game embodies the principles of French realism, to capture reality of the subject matter by using your medium to render the truth and have the message be shown by sheer association. Warco has players take control of a journalist in a war zone, as they must record the gunfights and images of war and poverty to be edited and broadcast to the world. It uses incredibly up-to-date examples of war and forces the player not to take up arms, but to learn and inform. Not only a true depiction of war journalism, but the game acts as a political statement by association. It does not necessarily take sides or force a message by use of artistic license or expressionism. Instead, it captures reality and allows the truth to speak for itself, just like French realist painters of the 1850s. Other games use this principle. 6 Days in Fallujah depicts Operation Phantom Fury.
Our role is to tell the true stories of what happened in Fallujah, as told to us by the people who were actually there. And I hope that through that players will gain an insight into this very historic battle, and that that insight can inform decisions that we are making now as as these events are continuing to unfold.
And the controversy around its hyper-modernity is less to do with the video game itself than the war it depicts. Mafia 2 also captures the realities of race and poverty in a post-war US in the space created that players are freely allowed to live in and experience for themselves, which is an example of reality and statement made using the techniques and philosophy of French realist painters and writers of the 1850s applied to video games. There are few games that use such techniques to make any real social or political point whilst maintaining the precedent that the aesthetics must match reality as best one can do. However, the design ideas remain the same. The mechanics of Warco imbue the game with a realist philosophy that allows the political element to remain honest and authentic. It is with certain abstract elements that this authenticity can remain without the need for photorealistic aesthetics. With the art, mechanics, or design, a game can hold the philosophies of the French realist movement. These abstractions, however, are what bring us to a more appropriate and fruitful comparison, I feel, in the Italian neo-realist films of the 1940s. Italian neorealism came in a post-war era in which artists and consumers alike were sick of romanticisms in films, particularly thanks to Mussolini and the right-wing propaganda of the time. Filmmakers began creating films that were less interested in the appearance of things, but in the idea behind the things. They began creating films that attempted to capture the socio-political truth in Italy, usually of the difficulties of poverty at the time. The techniques they used to capture the idea behind the things included using non-actors, filming not in sound stages but outdoors with natural lighting, long cuts to ensure completely natural pacing. Italian filmmakers were obsessed with authenticity, and so neorealist films were born out of a necessity to employ abstract things like editing and make it feel real to an audience so that the message can be put across effectively. These abstractions are what make analyzing such films so important to video games, as video games are full of mechanics that require some jump of disbelief to truly engage with both the medium and the message of the game. To begin, we must consider authenticity, as there is some artistic license involved with not only locating authenticity, but presenting it in just the right way in the design of the game so that it can be evident without overbearing. Expressive authenticity, as it is known, is an object's character as a true expression of an individual's or society's values and beliefs. Therefore, one must consider the values and beliefs of the subject matter to make authentic decisions in regards to a mechanic or a design decision. For instance, in EA Black Box's skateboarding game Skate, there is a great importance put on the authentic portrayal, not just in the activity of skateboarding itself, but in the culture of skating. Consider the game's camera, for instance. The game features a camera that looks and acts just like a real skating film would be shot. Not only does it have a kind of artificial fisheye lens shown with the dark corners around the edges, which are iconic to homemade DIY skate footage of the 90s and early 2000s, but the movement of the character has a slight amount of autonomy to it. When filming moving shots for skateboarding films, typically the performer would be followed by another skater who would hold the camera. They'd hold it low and point it upwards, and they would travel on a skateboard themselves. The filter, angle, and movement of the camera and skate are all indicative of a real skating film. This is not only realistic, but authentic, as it represents the post-punk DIY mentality and values of a typically lower-class subculture, using very do-it-yourself cheap techniques. This form of realist game design would not necessarily be considered appropriate for French realists, but could be considered neorealist as it embodies the expressive nature of that movement. After all, Skate's camera still has to function as a camera for players to use to play the game accurately, so it can't wobble and move and be 100% fisheye, as it would render the game almost unplayable. Therefore, some artistic license was needed, but still that authenticity and obsession with capturing the heart of the subculture is clear. Consider the unrealistic nature of Spec Up the Line's shooting and health mechanics, and yet the players can experience post-traumatic stress disorder with terrifying realism. As a designer, you can supplant real beliefs and ideas and opinions into your game without being 100% photorealistic. You must simply consider how to represent that subject authentically. The difficulty with analyzing video games with classical art and film frameworks is it is basically an attempt at co-opting their terminology instead of building our own, one that is most appropriate for our techniques and art form. Instead of being a reappropriation, we can consider it inspiration as long as we contextualize such ideas in a way that satisfies the complex needs of the designer-player relationship, the interactive nature of video games, and the complexities of mechanic and gameplay design. One way we can categorize game mechanics and the philosophies of realism is in what I call active authentic and passive authentic mechanics. Active authentic is a mechanic or set of mechanics that are interacted with during play that allow the player to feel whatever reality the game is about, such as authentic skateboarding mechanics. Passive authentic is when some element of the represented content is felt in some of the less constant play mechanics. An example of these ideas are exemplified in the two games Africa and Pokemon Snap, and how they represent the activity and culture of wildlife photography. Both games are about taking pictures and wildlife, although in Pokemon it is the wildlife of that universe, but the point still stands, although I'll go into that in a second. Now, Africa is an example of active authentic mechanics, as the game lets you free roam on foot and in car, and the idea is that you stock animals with their own artificial intelligence. Take pictures of them from any angle since you have free movement and free time. The most important factor of this is that it requires patience, which the photographer Sudhir Shivaram says is all about being in the right place at the right time. Therefore, it captures the feeling of the experience of wildlife photography. Through play, the player gets an active, authentic experience through mechanics. The problem with Africa is that it doesn't allow you to choose which photographs you can use to progress. That is decided by the game, as it has a hidden scoring system, kind of like the one used in Dead Rising's photography mode. This removes all forms of self-expression. Photographer for the hip-hop group Odd Future, Julian Berman, states that photography is a rather personal thing, so it is extremely important to maintain that sense of self-expression. In Pokemon Snap, players are encouraged to capture the animal on film first, then choose from their selection which photographs to use for progression. This is a perfect example of passive authentic, as it captures that important element of the culture of photography, self-expression, as it passively allows an authentic element into the game, as it is not intrinsically tied to gameplay, nor is it attempting to capture the essence of the culture with realistic accuracy. I feel these are two sides of authenticity and realism that are unique to games and worth consideration when discussing realism in games. So we've looked at how we can rethink our term realism in game design. Perhaps by breaking down the different forms of realism, we can see that the term is a little too vague for us, and so by taking inspiration from Italian neorealism and French realism, we can start to break it down into what I like to call active authentic and passive authentic, as well as considering authenticity and expression from the point of view of art historians. When you start to discuss authenticity, a lot of people may have different ideas about, for instance, what authentic blues is. Is it the grassroots Robert Johnson acoustic blues? Or perhaps the very idea of a singular voice expressing hardships is simply blues? There is a large amount of discussion left in this topic and others, but by taking inspiration from others and starting to think a little outside the box, we can hopefully evolve our language, our techniques, and hopefully our medium for the better. Thanks very much.